The name of the Lord is the biggest strength and is the most powerful mantra one can have amidst a difficulty. Just uttering the name of the Lord makes the Lord come to the help of the needy. The help may come in any form. For Draupadi, Krishna came to the rescue in the form of a sari, a vastra. Surdas ji says that the God's name stands out as the biggest power. One who has the Lord's name on his lips has all the power and is ever victorious.
सुनी री मैंने निर्बल के बलराम, सुनी री मैंने निर्बल के बलराम। पिछली साख भरूं संतन की, पिछली साख भरूं संतन की। अड़े सवारे काम, सुनी री मैंने निर्बल के बलराम, सुनी री मैंने निर्बल के बलराम। जब लगी गज बल अपनों बरतों, जब लगी गज बल अपनों बरतों, नेक सर्यो नहीं काम, नेक सर्यो नहीं काम। निर्बल हो बल राम पुकारो, निर्बल हो बलराम पुकारो। आए आधे नाम, सुनी रे मैंने निर्बल के बलराम। द्रुपद सुता निर्बल भयता दिन, तज आयो निज धाम, तज आयो निज धाम। दुशासन की भुजा थकित भये, दुशासन की भुजा थकित भय, वसन रूप भयो श्याम। सुनी री मैंने निर्बल के बलराम। अप बल तप बल और बाहुबल, चौथों है बलदाम, चौथों है बलदाम। सूर किशोर कृपाते सब बल, सूर किशोर कृपाते सब बल। हारे को हरि नाम, सुनी री मैंने निर्बल
Namaste to all of you. Nice to see you once again this morning. And some of you have joined, I know, at very inconvenient hours. You just heard this beautiful devotional song once again in Michu's voice. And this was a Surdas bhajan. Surdas was a devotee of Lord Krishna. And he brings out one very important fact that we may be limited in our strength. We may be weak, but then just calling upon the Lord makes available to us the strength of the Lord, which is unlimited. And a major example that he gives is that of Draupadi, who was being disrobed in the court of Dhritarashtra. And Dushasan was the one who was pulling her sari to disrobe her. She remembered Lord Krishna, and the sari became so long that Dushasan got tired. His limbs got tired. He didn't have the strength to pull anymore, but the sari never seemed to end. Now, today we start with yet another school of yoga, a major school of yoga, Raja Yoga. And as we saw in the introduction, while Hatha Yoga lays emphasis on physical perfection, Raja Yoga lays emphasis on mental perfection. My pranams to the mother and Sri Aurobindo, and their love to all of you from Sri Aurobindo Ashram, Delhi branch. And this course is a part of the 150th birth anniversary celebrations of Sri Aurobindo and the 75th anniversary of India's independence. Today our topic is Raja Yoga, and within that, the Yamas or restraints, things which we should try not to do. So yoga is a journey towards self-perfection, and self-perfection could have many aspects. Broadly speaking, two, the major instruments that we have, physical and mental. And the school that lays emphasis on mental perfection is Raja Yoga. We can look at it from an evolutionary point of view. What evolved first was matter, and that is what constitutes our body. And then came the life force, the vital, which animated dead matter, and we got living creatures. And then the next major leap was the development of the mind. And of course, the divine essence of all the living creatures, and in fact, also the divine essence of dead matter itself continued to stay rather obscure and hidden. But it was that which was behind, above, and beyond everything that manifested in the form of the body, the life force, and the mind. And what yoga does is to try and take us to a higher level of evolution than we are born with. And this is something which seems to be limited to human beings, who now have a very highly developed mind, but are yet far from manifesting the divinity that stays hidden within. And therefore, man is still half animal and half divine, and has a long way to go before the divinity that is hidden within as the soul actually manifests in all these parts of the being and starts getting reflected in our outer life. We saw that in case of Hatha Yoga, the Hatha Yoga, what is happening is that the life force or the vital, that illumines the physical or the body. In other words, a part of the being that manifests the divinity more than the one which evolved earlier is able to improve the function of the part that evolved earlier. So, the body manifests the divinity, that is dead matter, manifests the divinity to an extremely limited extent, so limited that it seems to be capable of knowing nothing and doing nothing. But once the life force came in, we had living creatures who could do so much. And therefore, life force is a more highly evolved force and manifests a little more of the divinity hidden than dead matter does. So if we let this life force illumine the body, the the bodily function improves, and eventually the body can overcome its limitations. And what are those limitations? Limitations like inertia, which gets reflected in our life as laziness, and a tendency to decay and degenerate. So those are the type of tendencies which matter has, and if it gets illumined, if it gets dominated, if it is under the influence of, entirely under the influence of the life force, then those limitations can be overcome, and we can call it a liberation of the body from its weaknesses. Now, in the same way, if we let the soul, which is the divine itself within us, the spark of the divine, if we let that illumine the mind, we'll be able to overcome the limitations of the mind. And what are the limitations of the mind? To construct a picture of reality based primarily on our sensory experience, maybe past experiences, maybe a bit of memory, but all the same, it remains an extremely limited way of looking at the reality. As the soul illumines it more and more, these limitations can be overcome, and so we can liberate the mind from these weaknesses. Now, the vital being, or the life force being intermediate between the body and the mind, when we activate that and let it do its job fully, it helps also in the next step, that is the soul illumining the mind. How does it do that? Because the mind also has a base in the physical, and that is the nervous system. So what prana basically does is to improve the functioning of this part of the body, that is the nervous system. And this is what has been, sometimes described in yogic language as the clearing up the blocks in the nervous system, as if the nervous system is clogged. Well, these are figurative ways of expressing it, but what it basically means is that letting the prana do its job better in the body affects not only the heart and the lungs and other parts of the body, it also affects the nervous system. And the result is that the nervous system, or the physical basis of the mind, now is able to function better and is able to access those realms of the consciousness which it could not earlier. So while outwardly the brain may remain more or less the same, but there are some subtle changes taking place within the brain which make it possible to channelize those realms of consciousness and make the individual aware of them, which it could not earlier. Please sort of note carefully that I'm just saying that the brain is now able to channelize those. The brain is now able to give an expression to those. So those realms of consciousness are universal in nature. And the brain is only an instrument to channelize a fraction of what is in the universal consciousness. Now, the fraction which it is able to channelize now is much more than it was before it came under the dominance of the soul. So if we let the higher dominate the lower part of the being, lower in the sense, the one which evolved earlier and is expressing less of the divinity. Otherwise, there's nothing like lower and higher, because these are all manifestations of the divine. But when we let that higher influence the lower, then the lower is able to manifest more of the divinity and thereby also overcome its limitations. So that is sort of a generalized way in which we can look at this entire process. The classic text of Raja Yoga is Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, and a beautiful translation and commentary on each of the sutras is available. It was done by none other than Swami Vivekananda, and the title of the book is Raja Yoga, Conquering the Internal Nature. Now, as in case of Hatha Yoga, Raja Yoga also has immense possibilities. Because if we develop the mind to its fullest, that is, let it express much more of the divinity than it ordinarily does, then we find that the human mind can go to an extent of knowing what is going on thousands of miles away, can know something about previous lives, and can even know what is going on in somebody else's mind. Now, all these things are possible. These are the type of special abilities which a Raja Yogi acquires if he spends long enough time on the discipline described by Patanjali. But then this strength itself can become a weakness, just as in the case of Hatha Yoga. Because if the person spends all the time just on acquiring these extraordinary abilities of the mind, then where is the time left to use this extremely well-developed mind in everyday activities? And therefore, in moderation, yes, improving the functioning of the mind is useful. And this can be done by reducing the ordinary chaotic surface activity of the mind so that now it can look deeper within. And this is what essentially meditative techniques are about. And we get a clue to meditative techniques from Raja Yoga, from Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. It is also useful in improving our ability to concentrate. And all these can be useful in everyday life. But then the attention that a person is able to pay to the development of the mind, to improving the performance of the mind by letting the soul illumine it, has to be limited and moderate to the extent that it also leaves time for everyday life, for using this better developed mind in everyday life. And everybody does not need to go to those levels of perfection of the mind that we are able to do all these extraordinary things. And in fact, when it comes to these extraordinary feats, which Patanjali describes in the third section of his sutras, which is siddhis, he himself warns that if you start utilizing these powers, start using these powers, then you may not be able to go to the next stage, which he describes in the fourth section, that is Kaivalya. Kaivalya is total liberation. So you will not really be able to liberate yourself from the bondages of life if you start using the abilities which have come in the third stage, that is siddhis. Now, the siddhis, why does he warn that they should not be used? Because that in a way is the last frontier. Because a person may think that after putting in so many years of effort, 24 hours a day, here is it that something I have got, and I can't even use that. So having something, having an ability and not putting it to use may look rather ridiculous. How can that happen? But then if the person is able to give up even that, then only he can go to the next stage, which means that why is that necessary? Because then it can lead to an egoistic feeling that I have abilities which others don't have. One can use them to impress others and become an exhibitionist. And that is why these abilities, as a rule, in general, should not be used. There are exceptions to everything. But by and large, you would find that yogis who have reached those levels of evolution rarely use those extraordinary abilities which they have acquired. However, Raja Yoga does have a significance even in integral yoga, and the significance is that like the body, the mind is also our instrument. And in fact, the two work together, the body and the mind work together. Therefore, the mind should not be neglected. And just as it is important to improve the functioning of the body, it is equally important to improve the functioning of the mind. And for that, we can use some of the basic principles of Raja Yoga. So once again, essentially yoga remains a methodized effort towards self-perfection. That is effort that we put in, effort which has a certain method about it. It's not haphazard effort. And this takes us towards self-perfection. In case of Raja Yoga, towards self-perfection, so far as the mental part of the being is concerned. And for that, the principal technique, that is that methodized effort, is meditation. Now, you might have seen that I have been using Raja Yoga and Patanjali's Yoga Sutras more or less synonymously, because it's called by both these names. Patanjali's yoga because he was the one who compiled what was known in this area in the form of his 192 sutras. And they are an example of brevity taken to its logical conclusions, because if you really were to print just those 192 sutras, you'll get a very small booklet, perhaps, each of them is 1 or 2 lines. So extremely small booklet, smaller than a pocket-sized book. But at the same time, the depth to which he has gone, one can imagine. So Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, since they are the form in which we have the knowledge in this area compiled beautifully, Patanjali's Yoga and Raja Yoga are used synonymously. And then in these sutras, Patanjali has divided his yoga into 8 limbs. Ashtanga. Anga means a limb. And into 8 limbs, and therefore it's called Ashtanga. Ashtam is 8, so 8-limbed yoga. Now, it's important to keep in mind that these are limbs. These are not steps. Because if we were to take them as steps, what it would mean is that unless one has climbed the first step fully, one is not qualified to go to the second step. And if we do it that way, then you'll find that hardly any of us would qualify even in the first step or the first limb over a lifetime, which means that we'll all be stuck at the first step itself most of the life, and we'll not be able to go to the second one. But all the same, why is arraying these 8 limbs in a particular sequence makes sense, because before going into those limbs, which would give us a clue to the technique of meditation, he has talked about a few very general things which would just make the person a better person, which means becoming a better person should come before we go to any specialized techniques. So we'll now try and see what those 8 limbs are, the 8 limbs of the Ashtanga. Now, the first of these is Yama, and there are 5 Yamas. And they should be observed in thought, word, and deed. Why that is important is because it's not just the deed, but also our thoughts and words which contribute to our level of consciousness. And in some cases, the deed may be in fact more important than in some cases, the thought and the word may be more important than the deed. Why? Because there are certain things which we have to do, but not having an attachment which is at the level of thought is important. For example, if the idea is to overcome sensory pleasures and one of them is food, we can't give up eating. But what we can do is give up attachment to food. So the deed of eating can go on, but the thought of being attached to the food has to be given up. So they have to be observed in thought, word, and deed, or as we say in Hindi, man, vachan, and karma. The first of these yamas or restraints is ahimsa or non-violence. And you would see that each of these yamas, which we'll talk about one by one, is rather complex. And therefore, a bit of discussion may be necessary. For example, ahimsa or non-violence seems very simple, not to kill anybody. But then the first thing is thought, word, and deed. So killing is the deed, but then having negative thoughts about somebody, using hurtful language, these are also a part of violence, and therefore these also have to be avoided. Then, we also come across complications because of our mind, which can go into minute details. How about plants? Plants also have a life, and we kill them when we eat them. So is that also a violence which we should not be doing? Now, here, what we have to see is that, firstly, the way the world is constituted, one form of life thrives on another form of life. So it's a sort of a recycling going on. And what we live on depends upon the way we have been constituted and our swabhava. Therefore, for a tiger to eat another animal is not violence. It is the way the tiger has been constituted. But a human being is constituted differently. And therefore, for the human being, killing an animal may become violence. How about killing plants? Well, for a human being, that is not violence because that is the way human being is constituted. That is what its swabhava is. But at the same time, the human being has gone beyond, say, vegetarian animals like monkeys and elephants. They are also vegetarian. But a human being goes beyond that. And what a person on the path of yoga can do is to pluck even a plant, a fruit from a plant, with a sense of gratitude and in a gentle way. For example, there are some plants which are useful in illnesses, like the tulsi, basil, sacred basil plant. Now, the traditional Indian way, which is in keeping with our spiritual heritage, is not just to pluck a leaf, but to thank the plant, to worship the plant because of what it is providing us. The mother has talked about going to a kitchen garden to pluck carrots, and she would communicate with the carrots, and she said that there were some carrots which would in fact offer themselves and say, take me, whereas some carrots would say, don't, please don't. And she would take only those carrots which offered themselves to her. So one can go to a subtle level, but at the same time, plants, if we consume plants as food, there's nothing wrong. In fact, the human beings go to ridiculous extents and sometimes behave worse than animals, because probably human being is the only animal who kills sometimes not only for food, as many other animals do, but also kills as a hobby and as a sport, for accessories like clothes and ornaments. Now, these are all reasons for which animals do not kill. And perhaps human being is the only animal who kills his own species. A dog would much rather starve rather than kill another dog. But human beings kill so many other human beings. So that way, we have a long way to go before we really understand even this simple thing such as Ahimsa or non-violence. One of the common questions that is raised is that the Gita is a scripture, and Arjuna has the dilemma whether to fight or not to fight. Naturally, fighting a battle would involve violence. And now he has developed this revulsion. He doesn't want to fight, especially because he finds that in front of him are his kith and kin. And therefore, he says that I don't want to fight for the sake of the kingdom. And lays down his arms and gives up. But then it is Lord Krishna who brings him to the point where now he is ready to fight. Now, how can a scripture itself justify violence and advocate violence? Now, that's a question which is commonly raised. Now, this we have to understand again a little better in the context in which the scripture was written. The scripture was composed at a time in history when, and to some extent these things, in terms, if we don't go into the exact form that these concepts have taken, they are perennial in nature. There are in society always some people who are by nature strong, capable of taking quick decisions. And these are the people whom one can trust to protect the territory of the country. That's why we have armies. So there are some people who are better suited for the army than otherwise. These are the people who become administrators and rulers. And along with that, those days, this type of people had also the duty of protecting good from evil and justice from injustice. So in fact, the basic purpose of this group of people who were called Kshatriyas was to protect good from evil and to protect justice from injustice, to keep the society clean, to preserve a certain minimal level of ethical standards in the society. And these people were called Kshatriyas. So therefore, to protect good from evil, if they had to fight a war, even that was permissible. And here, there was a situation in which the Pandavas had been treated unjustly, and to protect justice, this war had become necessary. At the same time, war was not used as the first option. it was after all the other options had been exhausted. So it means that once again, the battle was being fought only after the other peaceful options had been exhausted. But once it was decided that there is no other option but a battle must be there and there will be a war, then it was fought openly, keeping certain principles in mind. It was fought in the battlefield so that the civilians will not be affected. Only the two sets of armies are fighting each other openly, following a certain code of conduct, certain principles which would be fair to both parties without affecting the civilians. It was not a terrorist attack in which you just go and kill a few civilians to create terror. Choose your time and place and just kill a few people and run back. It was not that sort of violence. It was a violence which was in keeping with a certain system, which was considered quite acceptable, and using those principles so that only the soldiers who have chosen in their life to engage in this type of activity to protect good from evil are fighting each other, so that the one who is on the side of good and another side on the evil, they have fight and decide who emerges victorious. So this was the sort of battle which was being fought. And then finally, Lord Krishna does tell Arjuna to fight, but then along with that, in the Gita, he also teaches him in what spirit to fight. In the spirit of Karma Yoga, which means fight as an instrument of the divine. He's told that Lord Krishna tells him, so far as the Kauravas, that is the unjust party, so far as they are concerned, for all practical purposes, they are already dead. Because I have taken the decision to kill them. They have to die. But I want you to be the instrument to carry this out. You are dear to me, and therefore I want that you fight this battle and earn the glory that comes from winning a war. So do it in that spirit. And at the same time, he's told that while this will happen, you should fight this war without being attached to the outcome. While I have determined the outcome, but then you don't have to be attached to the outcome, which means you are not doing it for the sake of the victory which you are likely to have. So you fight without being attached to the outcome. And finally, fight without any desire or revulsion, without desire for a kingdom, and without any hatred for the Kauravas. So fight, but don't have any hatred even for the enemy. And then he tells him that rare are those Kshatriyas who get this type of an opportunity in their lifetime to do what they are here in the world for. And to do what we are here in the world for is our means of fulfilling the purpose of life. So not all Kshatriyas got even that opportunity, because every Kshatriya didn't have to fight a battle just to fulfill the purpose of his life. They were there, but then they fought only when a war really became necessary. So he told him that you are lucky to have in your lifetime this opportunity to fulfill the purpose of your life by doing what you are here in the world for. So that is the spirit in which he had to fight, and without any hatred for even the enemy, which is extremely difficult. But then those were the standards that were set for Arjuna to fight the war. So it is in this context that we have to understand why violence was justified. Sometimes, one tries to go around this and try and say that the violence advocated in the Gita is not really physical violence. It is just violence that we should be doing within ourselves, that is, fight our own negative tendencies like greed and hatred and so on. But in all probability, it was a physical war, and it was a physical war that Lord Krishna told Arjuna to fight, but with all these additional caveats and considerations, which I have tried to sort of put together. So with all these, yes, violence was also justified. So that's why you'll find that in each of these yamas, they are rather complex, and there are many subtle ways of looking at it, and some justifications even for violating some of these yamas. The next one after Ahimsa or non-violence is Satya. Satya means truth. And truth is not simple. Just to sort of lighten the mood, let me give you an example. There were some persons who were traveling in a car, and they lost their way. These were the pre-GPS days. No road signs, the road seeming interminable, forests on either side, and they didn't know where they were going. They were lost. Fortunately, after some time, they came across a cluster of houses, probably a small village, and there was a person walking on the pavement. So they stopped their car, rolled the glass down, and asked this person, please, can you tell us where we are? And this man replied, sir, you are in your car. Perfectly true. Perfectly true, but a useless truth. So truth is not simple. But anyway, taking it a little more seriously, to a serious side, truth can be many layered. And that's why Sri Aurobindo has said in Savitri, facts are the husks of truth. So often we equate truth with facts, but facts are only the husks of truth. And that is where scientific truths have their limitations, because science tries to base itself on facts. And that is where the limitations come in. For example, a person has argued who tried to be sort of as truthful as possible in a scientific book. He says that when we say that human beings have 2 legs, we are still not perfectly true. We are not speaking the truth, because if we really were to survey a very large number of human beings, probably the number will be near 1.98 or 1.99. Because some of the human beings are born with some congenital anomalies. They may have only a rudimentary limb, and some lose their limbs through accidents. So the number of legs that human beings have will not be 2. Now, that is a scientific obsession, you might say. But it's not always this type of an obsession which creates problems, the conflict between facts and truth. That is sometimes because of a bias, a prejudice. So you have facts, but then they are interpreted in a way that is prejudiced. Sometimes it is not just prejudice, it is also self-interest. For example, suppose a company that manufactures green tea sponsors a research piece of research to see whether it is helpful in preventing heart disease. They measure blood cholesterol levels, which is a risk factor. So they show through their study that green tea brings down the blood cholesterol levels. Now they blow it up out of proportion in their advertisements. That is one. So they blow it beyond proportion. Not only that, they are speaking only part of the truth. Why? Because not only green tea does it, but many other foods also do it. Green tea does it because of its antioxidant content, but the antioxidants are not limited to green tea. In general, all fruits and vegetables and spices also have antioxidants. And therefore, when they say that green tea does it and don't tell you the whole truth, this is because of self-interest. So, facts and truth can often come in conflict. And then, what is after all truth, basically? Truth is trying to sort of convey things exactly as they are. That is what essentially truth is about. But then there are so many situations in which we feel that if I convey an impression otherwise, it will not do any harm to anybody. So I can do it. And perhaps that may be true. But then when we do that, what we have to see is that it is not whether it's making any difference to others. More important in yoga is to see whether it is making any difference to me. What is it doing to my own consciousness? That is what is important. For example, suppose I decide to wear dark clothes because they will not look dirty. So I know that the clothes are dirty, but the impression that I'm trying to create is that I'm wearing clean clothes. Now the impression is different from what the reality. So in that sense, I'm not speaking the truth. And I don't have to say anything to do it. So it is not in terms of deed, but it is more at the level of thought. But, and it is not doing any harm to anybody else. What I have to see is whether it is doing any harm to my consciousness. So that is what's important. So, truth can have many layers. Then, that famous statement of Niels Bohr that the opposite of a truth is a still higher truth. Now, how can that be true? Again, to give a very simple and rather humorous example, or you can say at least light-hearted example, normally we say that time is money, which is quite right, because after all, some people don't sell potatoes and bread. They sell basically their time. A lawyer, for example, the consultation that he gives, or a teacher who teaches, they're basically selling their time. So time is money. So when they're giving time, they equate it with money. But then Oscar Wilde has said, time is a waste of money. Just the opposite. But then that is also true, because if you have spare time, then what you very often do is end up doing is go to the market and shop and waste money, spend money on things which you don't need. So time is a waste of money. So while time is money, time is also a waste of money. And at a deeper level, what Isha Upanishad says at one point is that in darkness are those who do not know. In still greater darkness are those who know. Now, how can that be true? Those who do not know, they are in darkness, that we can understand, because ignorance we equate with darkness. But how can those who know can be in a still greater darkness? Now, here what is implied is that those who do not know the highest truths of existence and construct their picture of reality based primarily on sensory experience, they are in a state of darkness, because they do not see the all-pervasive presence of the divine. That is a higher truth of existence, and that they do not know, and therefore for them, reality is what they can see and hear, primarily constructed on the basis of sensory experience. So they are in a state of darkness. Now, how about those who are aware of these deeper truths of existence and know that the divine is all pervasive? How can they be in a still greater darkness? They are in a still greater darkness if now they become what Sri Aurobindo calls the refusal of the ascetic. That is, they refuse to see the divine in what is manifest. They feel that the divine is there, that is the ultimate reality, but this manifestation is only a temporary reality, a shadow reality, an evanescent reality. It will not last. It is a fleeting reality. It is there today. It will not be there tomorrow. So it will like a dream. And they go to a point where they start rejecting and discarding this manifest reality. They refuse to see the divine in that manifest reality. They forget that this is also a manifestation of the divine. And that's why Sri Aurobindo says in his Upanishad, Jagadapi Brahma Satyam na Mithya. This universe is also true. It's not a piece of falsehood. It may not be the lasting reality, but all the same, while it lasts, it is real. And it is real in its recurrence, if not in its permanence in the same form. The form changes, but the changing forms are recurrent, almost eternal in their recurrence. So that's why the ascetic who refuses to see the divine in the manifest reality is in a still greater darkness. Why a still greater darkness? Because at least the one who is ignorant knows that to some extent that he is ignorant, and therefore there's a hope that one day he may know more than he does now. He may start seeing the divine in manifest reality. But the one who knows and refuses to see it is in a still greater darkness because of the smug satisfaction that I know everything. What can be higher than the truth that I already know? And therefore this person may not even hope to overcome this darkness in which he is living. So therefore he's in a still greater darkness. So being conscious of our ignorance is one step towards knowledge. So the one who does not know at least may be conscious of his ignorance and therefore may be able to take that step towards knowledge, whereas the one who knows and feels that there's nothing more to know is in a still greater darkness. So truth is not as simple as it looks. And finally, one example which I generally always give, that a situation in which telling a lie may be better than speaking the truth. Once a gunman entered a primary school, an elementary school in Connecticut in the US. This happened in December 2012. And he went around shooting a large number of children and teachers. In one of the classrooms, the children were very small, and the teacher told the children, sit in this cupboard, and I'll take you out when this man is gone. As soon as she had finished making these children sit in those cupboards and closed the doors of the cupboard, came the gunman in this very room. And he asked the teacher, where are the children? The teacher said, they have gone to the gym. He shot her dead and moved on. Later on, it was discovered that the children were in the cupboards, and the children said the teacher had said that after this man is gone, I'll take you out. Now, she managed to save all the children. She paid for it through her own life. But then what did she do just before dying? She told a lie. She knew that the children are in the cupboard, and yet she said the children have gone to the gym. Who told her to do that? Her own psychic being, which doesn't take time to tell us what the right thing to do is. So truth is not as simple as that. And why I'm emphasizing all this is that while I mean all these yamas have great value in our day-to-day life, no ethical code can have universal validity. And that is why the psychic being goes beyond all ethical codes. A few days back, one of the children studying in the Mothers International School in this very course, she had asked, what does the logo of the Mothers International School mean? And I must confess, I felt a little humbled, because I have seen this logo several times, perhaps also read what is written on it, but I didn't remember exactly what the logo says. I had some vague feeling that talks about going forward all the time, sort of a constant progress. That's what it talks about. But and it has a bird, so I told her that it's about going to greater heights, soaring high. But it both spoke of my poor sense of observation and not having reflected enough on the logo. But then after that, I had another look at the logo, and what it says is more true forever. Now, in a way, this is what essentially yoga is about. Because while something may be true, it may be a lower level of the truth, and it may be possible to go beyond it. As we have seen, truth has many layers. And therefore, even after we know something to be true, there is generally scope for going to a higher level of truth. And this can be an endless process. This can be the entire journey of yoga, because reaching the ultimate truth, the highest truth, which includes everything that there is what yoga is about. So the total reality is the total truth, and the total reality is the divine. And therefore, more true forever. That is, keep searching for truth at a higher level is itself the path of yoga. So in fact, these simple words encapsulate the spirit of yoga. And since we look upon this journey as a progress, as something that takes us upwards, the bird symbolizes it. The bird flies higher and higher. And that is what symbolizes moving from one layer of truth to a higher level of truth. And this can go on forever. There's a beautiful story that the mother has written. I'll not go into the story, otherwise we'll not be able to finish the topic today, but I'll find some opportunity to tell you the story. But anyway, the story starts with a party going on somewhere in the heavens. And this party is being attended by all virtues like sincerity, truth, honesty, courage, prudence, and so on. So these are all virtues who assembled here. And what is the venue of the party? Of course, it's in a celestial body, but then that particular palace where this party is going on has been called the Hall of Truth. Now, the Hall of Truth, why have all these virtues collected there, and what is the Hall of Truth? I think this is a symbolic way of putting that total truth beyond which there is nothing. So the total truth which encapsulates everything is the Hall of Truth. And therefore, this Hall of Truth is not the same as, when we tell a child, always speak the truth. Now, that is a simplistic way of at least making the child aware that you should say what the reality is, what you feel the reality is. So say exactly what you think, say exactly what you mean, say exactly what you observe. So that can be a good beginning, but that is only a beginning. That is not the end of what truth is about. So when we tell a child always speak the truth, that is not the same as the truth in this Hall of Truth. And that is what prompted Gandhiji to say, truth is God, God is truth. he said both the things. There's a book of his which is titled Truth is God. In that book, one of the chapters is Truth is God, and another chapter is God is Truth. So both are true, which in other words means that at the highest level, truth encompasses everything. And only God is everything, and therefore truth is God, and God is truth. Now we go to the third Yama, Asteya. Asteya means non-stealing. So these are negatives, restraints. Ahimsa, non-violence. Satya, not telling a lie. Asteya, not stealing anything, not taking anything that doesn't belong to us. It looks again very simple. Not picking up something that doesn't belong to us. That is what non-stealing is. But this can also have many subtle ramifications, especially when it comes to thought. Having a desire to possess something that doesn't belong to us is also stealing. We may not actually steal it, but wanting to get it, this thought crossing our mind that I should have it, is also a type of theft. Then there are many other subtle types of theft. For example, suppose I go to somebody, a friend, and I want to talk about my problems. Treating a friend as a counselor is quite common, especially in India. So we want to feel lighter by talking to that person. I don't care whether that person has the time or not. And I just go on and on with my story. I'm taking away his time, which he's not giving very willingly. He might give it out of politeness, but he's not giving it very willingly. Is that a theft of his time? Now, that can also be a type of theft. Then, what we call these days intellectual property rights and so on. Somebody else's material we use and pass it off as our own. Is that a theft? And, one can again think of so many other ways in which we take away something that really does not belong to us. We are participating in a conversation and we go on speaking while not giving anybody else a chance to speak, or sometimes even start speaking while somebody else is speaking. Is that a theft? We are taking more than our share of the conversation, trying to hog the conversation as it's called. Is that also a theft? Or we accept something which is not being given to us very willingly. Is that a theft? No, these are all things which one can think about. And therefore, theft itself can also have many subtle forms. And the ideal would be not to indulge in any of these varieties of theft, gross or subtle. Sri Aurobindo, in a famous letter to his wife, wrote that if he keeps for himself more than is strictly necessary for his needs, he would consider himself a thief. Now, that is the type of theft which probably Asteya is warning us against, because one would feel that so long as I have earned a certain amount of money in a ways that are legally and morally valid, then I can spend that money as I like. I can use all that money up if I like to fulfill all my desires. But here Sri Aurobindo is saying that if I keep for myself more than is strictly necessary for my needs, I would consider myself a thief. Because this money that has been given to me, is much more than my needs. And that is what was happening at Baroda, when he was in Baroda, much more than my needs. So I'm not its owner, I'm only a trustee. This concept of trusteeship, Sri Aurobindo has talked about, the mother has talked about, and Mahatma Gandhi talked about. We have only been entrusted with that wealth, and therefore we should look around and see, is there someone who needs it more than I do? And if I have something which I can spare and somebody else needs it, then since I'm only a trustee, I should share it. So that is, all this is implied in the word asteya. Now, brahmacharya, again a very ill understood, misunderstood word. The common interpretation is celibacy, or not indulging in the act of sex. Now, this interpretation is limited in at least two ways. Firstly, brahmacharya refers not just to sex, but to all sensory pleasures. And secondly, it doesn't uh, imply not indulging in the deed. More than that, it implies not indulging in thought. Why that is important is when it comes to food and sex, these are things which we can't really do without. Food, of course, we can't live without food, so everybody eats. Sex, yes. Some people don't get married, they don't indulge in sex. But then if that were the interpretation which Patanjali implied, then most of the world would in fact disqualify itself from yoga. Because if it were to be practiced on a large scale, if abstinence or celibacy were to be practiced on a large scale, the world itself will cease to be. And therefore the yoga then loses its meaning. So that is not what was implied. As the Bible says, if adultery has been committed in the mind, adultery has still been committed. So it is here the mind which is more important than the deed. The thought becomes more important than the deed. But then one would say that if keeping away from these sensory pleasures is important, then why have these been planted in us? For obvious reasons, because the two basic sensory pleasures are food and sex. And one is important for the survival of the individual, another for survival of the species. Not only have these been planted in us, they have also been coupled to joy and sorrow. If an animal finds food, it is happy. If it is deprived of food, it is miserable. And to overcome this misery, and in anticipation of the pleasure that it will get when it finds food, it looks for food. Same applies to the mate. So by coupling these basic instincts to emotions, nature has ensured both the survival of the individual and survival of the species. But then man is not just a feeding and breeding animal, and has higher urges and aspirations. And therefore, the person finds that while these basic instincts are intact and they need some satisfaction as well, but then the person cannot remain obsessed with these, cannot organize his whole life around these basic instincts. And therefore, the person realizes on reflection, which is again a part of his intellect, that these are pleasures which are rather fleeting and fragile. The pleasure that I get from these does not last very long. And they seem to be coupled with misery. They are a part of the dualities of life, and therefore they come with a price tag. The pleasure that I get comes with the price tag of sorrow. So the two go together. That is what dualities are about. So human beings start looking for something which will give us lasting pleasure, lasting happiness, and different levels of happiness. And the person finds that if I give up something at a lower level, a more fleeting pleasure, then I can go in for something higher. And in fact, that is something very basic. A person would be willing to give up something lower only if in exchange the person is getting something higher. For example, a student gives up the pleasure that the student gets from, say, spending too much time on the smartphone, going to social media and all those things. The student is willing to give that up for a few months or a few years for the sake of getting good marks in a board exam, so that the person can have a good career. So the career has more long-term implications. He thinks that that will provide happiness on a long-term basis as compared to the fleeting pleasure of spending time on the smartphone. So the person is willing to give up a short-term pleasure for the sake of a long-term pleasure. So I may deny myself now, but then I'm looking a little into the future and therefore denying myself. So that is also a type of thing, one type of giving up. But then the pleasure that comes, or the pleasure one can get from, say, a higher education, is also of the ordinary variety, in the sense that that is also fleeting in character and uncertain in character, unpredictable in nature. So the person starts thinking, is there something permanent? Now, permanent happiness can come only from something which itself is permanent, which is everlasting, and that is the divine. And therefore, for the sake of the divine, the person is willing to give up other things. Give up doesn't mean that he stops eating or he does not get married. What it means is that the person does not treat these things as a source of happiness. He does not become dependent on these for his happiness. It doesn't also mean that he doesn't enjoy them while he gets them. He enjoys while he gets them, but he does not miss them when he doesn't get them. That is what inner renunciation is about. That is, the detachment is within. Externally, the person is still consuming those things because they are a part of life. And if he's really truthful, then he's also enjoying them. Because it would be dishonest to say that, well, I can eat all types of food without being affected by it. I like them equally well. There will be some foods which will taste better than others. And therefore, while the person is, if the person denies that, he's violating another Yama, that is Satya. He is not speaking the truth if he says that I find everything equally good, whereas he's actually finding certain things more palatable than others. So he's finding certain things more tasty than others, and yet he's saying that I find everything equally tasty. So he's violating Satya. But so he can say that, yes, I enjoy this more, I like this more, and he can actually enjoy it while having it. But at the same time, he knows that I cannot depend for my happiness on tasty food. And therefore, if something is tasty but not healthy, he's willing to give it up or eat it in small amounts. And not only that, if today the food is tasty, he enjoys it. If tomorrow it is not tasty, then he does not miss what he had yesterday. So he doesn't miss it because he's not eating primarily for that. He's not dependent on food for his happiness. He has something much higher than that, where his happiness resides, where he's looking for his happiness. Now one might say that, can't we have both? Have happiness of the ordinary variety and also happiness of the higher variety? Here, again, there are two things we have to keep in mind. That in life, we have limited time and energy. And we do not have enough time and energy for everything, including things which appear worthwhile. So choice has to be made, firstly. Secondly, I never said that you don't have to enjoy good food. One can enjoy it, but not be dependent on it. That is what is important. And that is what the Isha Upanishad says in the very first mantra, Tena tyaktena bhunjitha. Tena tyaktena, unka tyag karo. Give them up, renounce them. Bhunjitha, enjoy them, bhog karo. So renounce and enjoy. Seems contradictory. How can one renounce and enjoy both? In fact, one can truly enjoy only if one has inwardly renounced. So inwardly you're not attached to it. You know that it is not a source of lasting happiness. My happiness does not have to depend on it. But then so long as I have a tongue, if something tastes good, I will enjoy it. But at the same time, if I'm not attached to it, if I'm not dependent on it for my happiness, I will not be thinking, will I get the same thing tomorrow? Or say, if I take another example, I like my house very much. I like all the objects that are in the house. But then I'll not be worried. How long will it last? When I go out of the house, a thief might enter and take these things away. I'll not be thinking of that. Because while I may like all these things, none of these things can be a source of lasting happiness. They're all amenable to change. The world can change in a moment. Be it a house, be it a child, be it anything. The house may be gone. Today it's there, tomorrow it may not be there because of an earthquake. And the child is with me today. The child may not be there tomorrow because this child has to move on and has settled down a few thousand miles away from where I live. So any of these things can, so while it is there, one can enjoy all these things, but then inwardly one has to renounce, and that will be possible only if we have found a higher principle on which my happiness now depends, and that highest is the divine. So that is the one to whom I have got attached. That is the source of my happiness, and since that is permanent and eternal, this happiness is eternal, and that's why I don't even call it happiness, because happiness itself carries that flavor of being fleeting in character. It is described by words such as joy, delight, bliss, ananda. And ananda is a state of steady peace, which is free from those fluctuations of joy and sorrow. It doesn't have the type of thrill which a person has while enjoying in a party. It doesn't have that type of a thrill. And but at the same time, there is a steady peace. So it is not that type of happiness which we associate normally with fulfillment of an ordinary worldly desire, which is coupled with sorrow. It is a steady peace, and that is what it leads to. And therefore, that is what brahmacharya is about. And the word itself means that Brahma is the divine, charya means movement towards the divine. So it's a progressive movement. It's a graded process. It's a continuous journey. It's not a one-step event. So moving in that direction, moving from the fulfillment of our ordinary desires, depending for my happiness on ordinary things, towards things which are higher. And the highest would be the divine, moving in that direction. Something which will last and something which will give steady, imperturbable peace. So that is what brahmacharya is about. Very difficult to keep in mind because of the barrage of messages which we get from our environment in advertisements, on the media, and so on and so forth, which promises a lot of happiness from fleeting pleasures. And therefore, one has to sort of swim against the current, keep one's head on one's own shoulders, and think for oneself to be able to appreciate these facts. The last yama, aparigraha. Parigraha, is accession. So aparigraha is non-accession. In the libraries, there are books and they have a label, and usually one of the items on that label is accession number. So if a library had, say, 2,000 books and it acquires one more book, the accession number of this book becomes 2001. So that is accession, or in Hindi, parigraha. So aparigraha is not adding to our possessions, not having any more possessions. In other words, not being greedy, not hoarding anything. Hoarding, of course, is a social evil. In times of scarcity, we find that if people start hoarding things which are already in short supply and further aggravate the shortage so that the prices would go up and they'll be able to make a profit. That, of course, is clearly unethical. But even at individual level, trying to get things beyond our needs, trying to increase our possessions is not in the spirit of yoga. And let's see why. Because you see, we increase our possessions either to boost our ego, say, I should have something because somebody else has it, and especially when I can afford it, even when I don't need it. So to feel that I should have more clothes, better clothes, a bigger house, better furniture in the house, these are all things which add to our possessions, but they are primarily to fulfill desires, which in turn are rooted in the ego. Because I feel that in some way, the image that I will have in society, the image that I'll have amongst my friends will improve if I have these objects also. And this can go to such an extent that eventually people even start buying things which not only they don't need, but they can't even afford. So that's how they feel they're always short of money. Because such is the barrage of messages that we get from the environment, again in the form of advertisements, etc., that they promise us a lot of happiness if we get more and more objects. And in fact, some advertisements also justified. There was one ad I saw which said, it is only human to want more. So, after all, you are a human being. So what is wrong with wanting more and more? So that is the type of messages that they convey. And therefore, it's very difficult to sort of keep in mind that, strictly speaking, we don't need too much. And before we decide to add to our possessions, it's good to ask, am I trying to add it just because I can afford it? Is it because others have it and I want to compete with them? Or will it make any substantial difference to the quality of my life? Quality of my life in terms of educating me, or entertaining me in a valid manner, or making me more efficient in my work? What type of a difference will it really make to my life? Will it be at the expense of something else? For example, if I buy a gadget which then keeps me busy with social media all the time? Will it be at the expense of the time that I should be spending living a healthier lifestyle? Will it be at the expense of the time I should be spending with my family? Now, these are all things to think about before we actually add to our possessions. So it's not that we should never add to our possessions, but we have to go to the spirit behind it, that adding more to our possessions to fulfill more and more desires, which can be endless, is something which is neither sensible nor in keeping with the spirit of yoga, which is about looking high, aiming high. In other words, it's about simple living and high thinking, not the other way around, not high living and simple thinking. Simple, what is simple thinking? That happiness resides in these objects. To get these objects, I need money, and therefore I should have as much money as possible and earn it any which way I can. So that is a simplistic thinking. Try to earn as much as you can, no matter how, because that is how I'll be able to get all those things which will give me happiness. And since happiness is not a sin, and that is the goal of life, so let me go for it. Now, that is the type of simplistic thinking which leads to parigraha, or accumulating more and more beyond our needs. In his translation and commentaries on the Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, which I just referred to earlier, Swami Vivekananda has said one very insightful thing about aparigraha. While translating this, his commentary says, aparigraha means not receiving gifts. Now, what have gifts got to do with it? A lot, in fact. It's a very insightful comment. Because if a person can refuse to accept a gift which is being given to him completely free, why will he go to the market to buy unnecessary things? And therefore, not receiving gifts can also be a very important sort of thing to keep in mind. Doesn't mean that if somebody gives you a small thing out of genuine love, we don't take it. But then we have to see behind what is behind the gift. Is it genuine love, or is it being given with some ulterior motives? Because all gifts are not truly gifts. So at least one should resist that tendency, accept a small gift only if it is given out of genuine love. And certainly one should not accept the gift and then add to one's possessions, add to possessions which one doesn't really need to. So that is essentially what aparigraha is about. Not being greedy, not hoarding, and not receiving gifts. So we have done the 5 yamas today, that is restraints, things which should not be done. You would be curious to know what the other 7 limbs of the Ashtanga are, because after all 8 limbs, and we have covered only 1 out of those 8 today, that is Yama. The second is Niyama, that is things which should be done. And Yama and Niyama put together are principles which would make us a better person from the ordinary point of view. Because if we ask anybody what is that one should do to become a better person, he would tell us some of these things, that be truthful, don't be greedy, don't steal, don't indulge in unnecessary sex, and so on. So these are some of the things which anybody would say to be a better person. And Yama also has a few such similar things which should be done. So Yama has the emphasis on things which should not be done, Niyama on things which should be done, and the two can be just 2 sides of the same coin. So in fact, they're closely related, as we shall see tomorrow. After that, the remaining 6 limbs are about truly disciplining the mind, which is what Raja Yoga is about. And the 3rd limb is asana, because meditation also in a way starts with an asana, sitting in a stable and comfortable posture. Then pranayama, a certain simple form of pranayama, slow breathing, is a part of meditative techniques. Pratyahara, that is sensory withdrawal, withdrawing from sensory experiences around and from what is emanating within the mind. Unnecessary, unwanted thoughts, that is pratyahara. Dharana, concentration. And dhyana, letting the mind dwell on the object of concentration. Samadhi, strictly speaking, is not a part of the technique of meditation. It is the product of meditation, a product of practicing the remaining 7 limbs long enough. So that is what Samadhi is about. So what we'll do is in the next session, talk about Niyamas and leave the rest for the session on meditation. Raja Yoga forms the third chapter of this book, a primer on yoga. And this chapter is a pretty long one, about 40 pages. And if you want to go still further in depth, then in the synthesis of yoga by Sri Aurobindo, this forms volumes 23 and 24 of the complete works of Sri Aurobindo. It occurs at two places like Hatha Yoga, in the introduction, in chapter 4, from pages 35 to 37, and in part 2, chapter 28. Sorry, it should be Raja Yoga, not Hatha Yoga. Raja Yoga occurs from 536 to 542. Is, these type of errors come when you try to modify what you prepared earlier. So I modified the last time slide. I changed everything, including the page numbers and the chapter number, but I forgot to change Hatha Yoga to Raja Yoga. Thank you. This was on the chat box. So I've been told, while you're thinking about other questions, I've been told one of the questions is, are these books available in Hindi? The synthesis of yoga is available in Hindi too. The primer of yoga will be available probably within about a year because the translation is almost complete.
Yes, Vishal, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, Dr. Bijlani ji, thank you so much for such a wonderful lecture. I had two questions. One pertains to one of your earlier lectures on rationalistic humanism and views of Sri Aurobindo on them. And the second is, which Ved pertains to Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, and is synthesis of yoga taking cues from Patanjali's Yoga Sutra and Veda, or something else? Thank you.
And the first question, rationalistic humanism. Rationalistic humanism was a product of the you can say Renaissance, European Renaissance, in its later stages, when some of the limitations of science were realized. It was realized that science itself will not be able to wipe out the problems of human existence. But at the same time, the West did not want to go back to religion, which involved considerable sort of dogma and irrational beliefs. And therefore, they wanted to have a system of ethics which is based on rationality. That is what essentially rationalistic humanism was about, and Sri Aurobindo has called it one of the finest products of the age of reason. Europe was going, for Europe, the period of Renaissance was the age of reason. But then rationalistic humanism also, Sri Aurobindo said, would fail, and it did fail, because no matter how well-intentioned a particular way of thinking is, the level of consciousness of those who come to practice it, give it a practical shape, is going to determine how effective it will be. Because ultimately it boils down to that. And so long as the basic human level of consciousness, the average level of consciousness, continues to be ego-centered, nothing based on rationality would really work, because one would be able to twist the reasons in such a way as to justify what one is doing, even if it is not in keeping with the spirit of, say, humanism in this case. So that is why these things would fail and have failed. And when the West realizes that what they thought would work has not worked, at least they would have learned everything that does not work. So everything based on rationality would fail, and these failed experiments would teach them, if reason is not working, if reason is not adequate to solve the problems of human existence, let us look beyond reason, something higher than reason. And that is what they would discover in ancient Indian wisdom, and that's why they would need it at that stage. So this is what rationalistic humanism was about. I think your second question was what the synthesis is based on. We'll come to that when we come to integral yoga. But what Sri Aurobindo has done is to preserve the spirit of yoga, which in fact had started getting overshadowed by the external form. And we can understand it because even today it continues to be overshadowed by techniques such as asanas, pranayamas, and meditation, which are the visible aspects of yoga, which are the external form which yoga takes. So since the external had come to dominate the field of yoga to such an extent that the spirit underlying yoga was being subordinated, Sri Aurobindo undertook this synthesis. And in this synthesis, the effort has been made to understand these various schools such as Hatha Yoga, Raja Yoga, and so on, in light of the spirit of yoga, which did underlie all these schools, but got forgotten. So while the spirit has been preserved, and also the basic principle, such as in case of Hatha Yoga, that the body should not be neglected and should be taken good care of. Similarly, from Raja Yoga, that the mind also should be taken into account while practicing yoga. We should try to improve the functioning of the mind. While all this basic principle has been accepted, the synthesis did not go to such an extreme that the person would spend all the time either perfecting the body or perfecting the mind. I think your question also included, is it based on the Vedas? Now, in a way, yes, everything is based on the Vedas because that is the most ancient spiritual literature that we have. And there's a continuity from the Vedas to the Upanishads. However, there is a transition we find from the Vedas to the Upanishads and from the Upanishads to the Gita. And the transition roughly is like this, that in case of the Vedas, there's a lot of symbolic language used, and there is quite a bit of space given to various rituals. In the case of the Upanishads, it is pure philosophy and very cryptic sometimes, and to such an extent that it becomes difficult to understand ordinarily. So Upanishads have that. Gita overcomes the limitations of both. It doesn't talk about any rituals. It is rather brief. But unlike the Upanishads, which are also brief sometimes, unlike the Upanishads, it makes yoga very user-friendly, easier to understand. The context of a story, stories are easier to understand than abstract philosophy. It solves a problem. So anything which has a problem-solving approach is more appealing. And then the Lord himself gives the assurance that every step that you take will bring you something. And you can turn to me whichever way you like, through action, knowledge, or devotion. All types of devotees are acceptable to me. So that makes the whole approach very user-friendly and brings yoga to the common man. So Sri Aurobindo has taken into account the basic principles of primarily these three traditional schools of yoga and worked out a synthesis so that, in Gita, you'll find that it's Sri Aurobindo's integral yoga leans heavily on the yoga of the Gita. But then in the Gita also, there are certain things which are not there. For example, the Gita does not talk about keeping your body healthy through asanas and a good diet, etc. There's hardly anything about that. The Gita does not talk much about how to perfect the mind through the technique like meditation, which Raja Yoga does in great detail, but the Gita talks only briefly in the 6th chapter. So there is, Sri Aurobindo has sort of in the synthesis kept all that in mind, and that is how it becomes, in a way, complete. Integral means complete. So integral yoga is a complete yoga, which takes into account all the important features of the major traditional schools of yoga, and yet in a way goes beyond them. And how it goes beyond them, that we'll see when we talk about integral yoga.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
The next question in the chat is, the difference between asatya and apagraha does not seem to be very sharp. Would you like to comment?
Well, to some extent, all these things are related, but for convenience, one does divide them. The overlap between asatya and aparigraha, that is,
asatya, no, not asatya, asteya. Asteya and aparigraha.
Okay. Asteya and aparigraha. Yes, there is a greater overlap there between asteya and aparigraha, between brahmacharya and aparigraha, because all these things are basically about reducing one's desires. And desires, Sri Aurobindo says, are primarily rooted in the ego. Desires starve in the absence of support from the ego. And that's very easy to understand, because if we think about all our desires, one would find that most of them are not real necessities. Most of them are about things which we do not need, and we still want them because in one way or the other, they are giving us an ego boost. So it is, since the ego is about separation, ego is a separative tendency, and yoga is something which leads us towards love, which is a uniting tendency. So therefore, that there comes in the opposition of the ego as it is ordinarily expressed, and love, which yoga is about. And that is why desires which are rooted in the ego become an obstacle on the path of yoga. And even otherwise, desires are in fact the root of all misery, as Lord Buddha said. And this applies not only to unfulfilled desires, it also applies to fulfilled desires. Both unfulfilled and fulfilled desires can be a source of misery. And maybe someday I'm sure in this course, we'll have an occasion to talk more about how both can be a source of misery. So asteya, aparigraha, brahmacharya, they're all basically about reducing one's desires.
Okay, the next question is, could one just draw a line under the past and take this new moment to practice from now on the yamas?
Sure. That is the beauty of the path of yoga. One can start at any point in time, anywhere in life, start from where we are and move to something better. That is what the journey of yoga is about.
Okay, next question is, if Arjuna has to fight without attachment to outcome and kingdom, then what was his motive to fight and what divine wanted him to achieve with this fight?
Yes. The motive in sort of jargon, in terms of jargon, would be arise in the level of his consciousness. That would be the motive. And that itself brings joy. The mother has also talked about the joy of effort. So irrespective of the outcome, there is a certain joy implied in the effort itself. So one can enjoy the effort even without being attached to the outcome.
Okay. The next question is, how not following the first limb Yama hamper one's progress in spiritual path or to attain Samadhi?
Yes, this is a common misunderstanding. People think that yamas, well, they are there, but the main thing is meditation, and through meditation, somehow I'll reach Samadhi. It doesn't happen that way. It's like trying to sort of think of unfurling the flag on the rooftop without constructing the building, leave aside the foundation. The foundation are yamas and niyamas. The other limbs up to dhyana are the building. Samadhi is the flag that has to be unfurled on the rooftop. We have a tendency to feel that somehow I'll be an exception. I'll be able to have the best of everything. But nature is not organized on that principle. It doesn't operate on the principles of compassion for selected individuals.
I think that will be all the questions. Since we are at the end almost. I just want to take few minutes of yours and share the screen. And I wanted to share that there's a book available on the course website, which is called Small Doses of
Spiritual Wisdom.
Spiritual Wisdom, Small Doses. And you can download it. If you can share the screen, see the screen, this is it is appearing. And you can also see the link of the book in the chat box. So you can download this book, and it has small essays on all the topics which Sarah is discussing in the course. So today, like how we discuss Yamas and all the other aspects of Raja Yoga, you will find the essays. So you can go through, download and read it at your convenience. So this is one thing which I wanted to share. And as usual, we end it with a group song. I'll just share the screen. And in that group song, each line will be sung twice. So once you can hear it, and then later on join and sing along.
चंचल मन नित ओम जपा कर चंचल मन नित ओम जपा कर 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 गहरा सागर टूटी नैया गहरा सागर टूटी नैया जीवन तरनी ओम खेवैया जीवन तरनी ओम खेवैया पार करेंगे पार करेंगे पार करेंगे पार करेंगे ओम जपा कर ओम जपा कर ओम जपा कर ओम जपा कर चंचल मन नित ओम जपा कर ओम जपा कर ओम जपा कर ओम जपा कर ओम जपा
काय केलं तिला
सार तत्व
तिचे केस विचारले डोळा रहता है
खोज किए जा सारे तत्व की खोज किए जा नाम सरस रस रोज पिए जा नाम सरस रस रोज पिए जा पार करेंगे पार करेंगे पार करेंगे पार करेंगे ओम जपा कर ओम जपा कर ओम जपा कर ओम जपा कर चंचल मन नित ओम जपा कर 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 पल पल छिन छिन घड़ी घड़ी निस दिन पल पल छिन छिन घड़ी घड़ी निस देना। ओम जपा कर, ओम जपा कर, ओम जपा कर, ओम जपा कर, चंचल मन नित ओम जपा कर, 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 ओम जपा कर।
See you on Monday.